Before we begin, a huge thank you to Edmund once again for sending these pair my way, the LETSHUOER DZ4, so that I can give you guys my honest opinion, my unadulterated review on this. So, let's begin. Now, LETSHUOER, I'm pretty sure everybody knows of this brand. Mainly, I think its inception of it slowly becoming more famous is from the LETSHUOER S12s, and then that came out the S12 Pros. Z Reviews did a collab on it, so on and so forth. It was initially quite famous for the planar magnetics, and now they are having some other types of iterations in their lineup. This one specifically has a very interesting config. This is mainly to cater to the market where, you know, most people will be like, I don't want things that are single DD anymore. I want things that are a little bit better. And depending on how you do this whole thing, it definitely has different types of results. I still remember the Kiwi Ears Quartet is still by far the best bang for the buck type of budget IEM so far. But that's not about that today. We're talking about the DZ4. The DZ4 specifically has 3 6mm BAs and 1 passive radiator. So what is a passive radiator? If let's say that this is an enclosure and there is a driver here, and you have another thing here, which is what you see kind of like a dynamic driver, that is the passive radiator. The one difference between a dynamic driver and a passive radiator is that a passive radiator is literally just the diaphragm of the driver. And if it's in an enclosed space where there is a driver on top and the radiator is down there, it basically helps to increase its resonance so that it can help better certain frequencies. And in very specific cases, and in most cases, it is always to better the bass, specifically for the sub bass, because the LETSHUOER DZ4 definitely is very well known for the so-called passive radiator aided sub bass. Now, with all that being said, y'all still remember, y'all know my shtick. Unboxing time, even though I accidentally unboxed a little bit. But yeah, this is the box for the LETSHUOER DZ4. Maybe I can just show it like this so that it's easier for me. For simple as it can be, just the spec sheet, so on and so forth. You have LETSHUOER right here, and removing this, you are being greeted with, you know, your standard case with a silver embossed LETSHUOER logo. And opening it up, you will be greeted with a few paperworks. I literally just noticed this right now. It's an instruction pamphlet. I have talked about this in the Tangzu Changle video. This thing is actually quite useful for people who are still not acquainted to, like, you know, over-ear IEMs or, you know, over-ear earphones in general. So yeah, that's one good thing. Other than that, you know, you get your paperwork. Now, on to the main part of this whole review, which is the IEMs. And you have a hard case. Now, this hard case, it has the same type of hand feel as the Galileo. It's soft touch, but it doesn't feel like it's gonna, like, you know, be sticky if you use it too long, but you get the idea. And it comes off by screwing. You are being greeted with tips that are being presented in the most special way possible that I've never seen before, in the radio way. See, they clearly have a lot of thoughts for the design. This whole box is very simplistic, but, you know, the details on here specifically, they're quite good. Removing it, you got your free snacks. Please don't eat it, don't sue me if you actually eat it. And you get the standard LETSHUOER type of cable. You definitely know that this design, this gray color type of braiding, 4-core braiding, is already quite ubiquitous to LETSHUOER, but I feel like this thing is a little bit tad bit better than the S12s from what I can remember, because the S12s, I still remember, it's a little bit more rigid. So, all that being said, let's talk about the build and fit. Now, in terms of the build, LETSHUOER actually partnered up with some other type of brands, which honestly, I keep forgetting the name. What's the name again? They collaborated with a company called HeyGear, which is a leading 3D printing supplier. Hence, which led us to know that this is a 3D printed resin shell. And with the 3D printed resin shell, it has quite a matte finish to it, which actually feels very nice to the touch. And it has a CNC faceplate, which is said to be CNC milled anodized aluminum casing with semi-open design. Why do we say it's semi-open design? Because as you can see by the accented CNC'd out positions here, the zigzag type of pattern, it is actually having a grill underneath this whole faceplate. So technically it is semi-open, and I would believe that because this thing, if you've noticed, has no vent holes for some reason. And I'm very sure that the venting system is done in a way where this back piece is being used as the vent, because you know there's no driver. And let's not forget that this thing is a guided tube design, because yep, as obvious as it can be, the nozzle already has a few guided tubes. So y'all have very good design, that's all I will say. And in terms of its fit, how does it fit? Me personally, I cannot fit any of the two types of tips that they give, and hence I went with my standard CP145, so take that as you will. But regardless of that, the DZ4 fits amazing. It is very light, it is 5.31 grams, and you know, I think the weight actually speaks for itself. There's not really that much to talk about. It's really light. And one more thing to take note is that this thing has a flat tube in termination. It is not recessed. So what does that mean? It means that it has better compatibility with all of your cables. And oh yeah, I just want to add one more thing, because you know, I also do some cable rolling myself. This thing I would say is quite sensitive to cable rolling, because there's certain type of IEMs that I've never mentioned before that is very not giving a damn about cable rolling. Mainly the Katos. The Katos really do not care what kind of cables it's being used on. It sounds the same regardless of anything. This thing has some certain sonic properties being changed. So yeah, for people who like cables, take that as you will. Which, you know, let's just segue on to the actual part of our review, which is talking about the sound. So file got corrupted. I'm too lazy to refilm, so let's continue it like this. Now in terms of the sound, this is the source that I use, and this is the graph. In very general terms, the LETSHUOER DZ4 is a neutral tuned IEM, even though the graph kind of says otherwise, but it is a neutral tuned IEM with bass boosted properties. This is where I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the bass rather than the mids and the highs, because you know, the passive radiator inside the LETSHUOER DZ4s are the highlight of this IEM's config. In my personal opinion, before I actually start talking about the bass, my one comment about this is that if neutral tuning was done right, and it is still a little bit fun rather than, you know, actually being flat all over the place, you know, sort of like actual reference monitoring, this one is like if I want something that is a little bit less exciting than balance. So this is quite on par with what I was describing. But anyways, bass. Owing to the passive radiator, you're definitely having some significant amount of sub bass throughout this whole use of the LETSHUOER DZ4, because like I said, this thing sounds neutral, and for a neutral IEM to suddenly have sub bass is kind of, you know, a little bit being caught a little bit off guard. But regardless of that, the bass is still fine, because like I said, this is a neutral type IEM. The bass is definitely going to be having a neutral type of tonality towards it. Why can I specifically talk about tonality on the bass? Because you know, it's neutral, it sounds lean, but overall it is very nice. It's lean, it's hard. I wouldn't say it is cold, but you can definitely hear everything very clearly. The amount of bass, specifically sub bass, is definitely there, but it is not to the point where it becomes something like balance or U-shape, something like that. One gripe that I could probably say is that maybe in very certain cases, I have one specific case where I'm listening to the usual test tracks that I'm listening to, YOASOBI the book. For some reason, the bass just sounds a little bit weird. It is very specific, but I can still kind of tell you how it is. Imagine the sub bass is like this, and suddenly the lower bass drops, and then it suddenly goes back up in the mids. There's some weird things going on there, but luckily that is only the one instance that I find it kind of weird. In other albums, it's probably safe. I've listened to Tyler the Creator, I've listened to Mac, I've listened to Kanye West, all of those, they don't have that problem. I even listen to other J-pop albums, they don't have that problem. So I'm pretty sure it's probably just a mix, but I have at the same time, let me go off on a tangent, but I have at the same time talked to some other people. They do say that for certain people, they really find this bass tuning a little bit off. They don't really know how to describe it, but it's probably something within the realms of what I said. It just doesn't sound that smooth. It sounds like it's a little bit special. That definitely caught me off guard a little bit when I was listening to that initially, but overall it's still good. I might be over rambling, but let me just give you a very quick summary in general terms without that one specific caveat. Neutral tuning, very lean bass across the board. You have sub bass that has very good rumble, very good presence, but not very high shelf. It is still a very, I would say, sort of close to balanced type of bass shelf for the sub bass, and then the rest is definitely just neutral. But despite its neutrality, it is quite dynamic still. That is what I will want to comment on. Lean, very good tone definition, neutral tonality, no bass bleed. That's for sure. There is literally no bass bleed to the mids. And speaking of the mids, how will we actually describe the mids? Y'all know I like my vocals, so I'll definitely be talking about the vocals first. Female vocals, I have mentioned that it is presented in a fairly okay way for neutral tuning because, again, neutral tonality and maybe carried on by a little bit lightness, but maybe not 100% resolving. I think this not 100% resolving part is a little bit true on both sides, maybe less on male vocals. I'll tell you why in a minute when we talk about the instruments, but that's what I heard for female vocals. Male vocals are, in my personal opinion, probably a little bit better and more transparent to the mix. What I mean by that is that depending on how the person's vocals are being mixed, you will definitely hear it as true as it is, because maybe male vocals are a little bit, lower down the spectrum. It might affect its presentation in a way, is what I'm saying. It is crunchy when it needs to be crunchy, it is sharp when it needs to be sharp, but it still is very, very delightful to listen to. Going on to the instruments, the things that I would want to say is that overall, the LETSHUOER DZ4 comes off as something that presents instruments in a very light way. Maybe occasionally it sounds a little bit airy, but not too airy. It sounds bright, and you could say at the same time, because of its neutral tonality, again, it might be a little bit transparent. But like I mentioned regarding the female vocals, it might be a little bit less resolving. You can have something that sounds the resolution is maybe slightly off a little bit, comparing this to something that's almost the same price range of it, such as the Aria. Now the Arias are definitely very aggressive, very sparkly, even though the tuning doesn't really compare with this. It's totally two different tunings. I think that's probably the best way for me to describe the difference in resolution. This thing, I would say something that would probably best resemble it is something like maybe a tad bit less than the Wu Zhi Tian heyday. But when I say it's better, it's only like maybe marginally 10% better in terms of the resolution. So this thing is still quite the well performer. What's quite the well performer, man? My English sucks now. But okay, too much talks. Wrap up on the bits. Female vocals, light, tonality very neutral, occasionally maybe not 100% resolving. Male vocals, transparent to the mix. It needs to be good when it is being mixed good, and it sucks when the mix sucks. Instruments overall are very light. Instruments are overall very sparkly, airy in certain cases, but maybe a little bit less resolving. And for some reason, this is what I wrote. Horns are more pronounced in terms of like it comparing to other instruments in the mix, and as well as keys and synths are quite forward. That's what I found. Now in terms of treble, I don't think there's anything much to talk about here because trebles like more or less the same for almost everything. This one specifically, cymbal and hi-hats sound crispy, but they do not sound heaty. They do not sound very fatigued. Other notes that I have noticed when I was listening this throughout the week is that bells and guitar shreds also hold that level of just the right amount of sparkle and bling without too much heat. So take that as you. Now in terms of its technicalities, I would say overall the most intriguing part that I feel like should be addressed first is the soundstage, because this thing is literally only like $10 US more expensive than the Aria. But the soundstage of this, I dare say, because I've tested this multiple times, is wider than the Kato. This thing is wider than the Kato, so the price probably does not justify its prowess in this. Overall, the width is definitely quite wide, but I would say for the depth part, that's probably that one very generic problem with it, where even though I say it's very wide, but the problem persists when, if let's say it's directly in front of you, the depth is this far, then the depth slowly decreases until, when it reaches here, it kind of converges into a very shallow depth at the end. That's what I heard. Imaging and separation, I don't think there's going to be any big problems considering that the soundstage is already this wide, and then you are definitely paying a premium for people who rarely want to pay something that's close to 100 US dollars for this. Imaging of all the elements in the tracks are definitely separated well, so yeah, I don't have much to say about that. Dynamics, again, because this is a neutral type of IEM, I really do not expect anything to go wrong about this. When you are cranking up the sound, I still feel like everything is being balanced out very, very well in terms of its, its amplitude. The sub bass, even though if you're cranking it quite high for like, the 5-minute hyped up listening experience, it is still not overwhelming. It is still not very bloated. Nothing really goes wrong. It's still very good. Detail retrieval, I would say it is good enough to insinuate the whole ambiance of the music, but not to a very strong degree. I would say among all of those stuff, detail retrieval is probably the only one that is close to the budget to value ratio. This thing is good in terms of its detail retrieval, but it just does enough to, like, insinuate certain stuff, like maybe. But with all that